Welcome to the second of 3 cybersecurity workshops. My name is Marva Galawulu, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Learning and Member Engagement Specialist for Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. A few housekeeping items before we begin. While I go through today's guidelines, we'd love to learn who is in the room with us. Please introduce yourselves in the chat by sending your name, title, and organization, pronouns, and native land. We'll recap the items to share. Next slide, please. As a continuing SVCN practice, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the native land that each of us are on today. Together, let us commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous peoples, communities neglected and displaced by the US government and other colonial powers across the world. We will include some resources to help with your learning in the chat. I know people here are tuning in from different areas, so I encourage you to learn what land you're living on by using the website we'll share in the chat and share that information in your introduction. Maps can be insufficient and may not fully represent shared spaces, time periods, overlapping territories, and so much more. We encourage you to learn more by engaging with the local Indigenous-led and serving nonprofits in your community. Next slide, please. For accessibility purposes, we do have the automated closed captioning feature in Zoom activated. Now with this, you do have the ability to move the captions around your screen to a place more convenient, or you can disable the closed captioning feature entirely if you prefer to not have it up. To do so, please reference the bar at the bottom of your Zoom. Click on Live Transcript on the right, and then click Hide Subtitles. If you're having any tech or other troubles during this session, please private message me directly in the chat. We do ask you to remain on mute throughout the program. Please use the chat to send questions. There will also be time at the end for a Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers from Pocket Security, Ashley Chapman and Keaton Fisher.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Ashley Chapman here. We'll start rolling right into our slides. Next slide, please. So I figure it might help to kind of lay out the roadmap for our meeting today. So we'll do a brief round of introductions, kind of explaining the background of myself as well as Keaton, and then we'll discuss a bit about frameworks, compliance to frameworks, as well as security education and compliance. We'll talk a bit about privacy, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So I'd first like to introduce a little bit about myself. Ashley, I am from the East Coast. My background is historically in technical support, but I especially love educating people about security, especially the importance of security when it comes to nonprofits. And then I'll allow Keaton to introduce himself a bit.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so I enjoyed the security awareness part as well. I'm currently a customer success manager with a cybersecurity vendor. We handle compliance and governance things over there, so I'm fairly well versed with helping onboard companies and clients, helping them with their compliance initiatives.
Amazing, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and we'll start right at the frameworks overview. So over to you, Keaton.
All right, cool. So as Ashley said, welcome everybody again. Pretty excited to be here again. And in our last webinar, we mentioned frameworks. We kind of went over it fairly quickly. So we'd love to dive deeper into some of that today, and then we'll be pivoting to some privacy recommendations near the end because we had quite a few questions regarding that area. So we'd love to dive into that as well. So if we jump just straight into the slide. A framework is essentially a regulatory or voluntary series of controls or actions that define the best set of practices or guidelines for a particular area in information security. So some of these frameworks, they encompass security in its entirety. So they're meant to be like a broad framework for a security environment in its whole, but some are only relevant to specific areas of data. And if we kind of look under the hood, basically what a framework like this might look like is a whole bunch, probably hundreds of individual controls in a big list that state the goal of the control, guidance on how to implement it, why it's relevant, etc. It's basically, you can think of it like a big list of policies, actions, controls that should be in place within your environment. So again, when we look under the hood at a framework like HIPAA or PCI, again, it's basically just, you can sum it up as a bunch of controls or policies that need to be implemented. So why is this relevant? Why am I here telling you about this today? So when you think about your organization and the ways to begin building out, or at least thinking about cybersecurity in a more granular way, frameworks, compliance, it's a great place to start because they essentially list out hundreds of controls that you can implement. And you might also be required to actually be compliant with some of these frameworks, depending on the data you handle. So it's a great place to start. And next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the best places to start, in my opinion, within when you're looking at compliance and frameworks in general. Again, we mentioned this in our last webinar. So the NIST CSF. So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is a gold standard within the industry. And the aim of it is to reduce and manage cybersecurity risks. So it's intended for all types of organizations, and whatever size you are. And the goal is to create a strong baseline to build your security posture off of. And at a high level, the CSF separates into 5 core areas, or pillars as they call them. So there's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these 5 core areas are what the founders call, or it's what the founders of the NIST CSF believe to be the best way to represent a successful and holistic cybersecurity program. But essentially what these are going to provide is a way to holistically build out your security program or improve your current one, because it's touching on 5 major areas that you need within your organization to mitigate cybersecurity risk. And again, what that might look like is just a big list of things you should have in place. So perhaps you might see something like number 1, physical devices and systems within your organization are inventoried. Number 2, threats are identified and documented, et cetera, et cetera. And what this is going to do for you again is help build out or mature your organization's cybersecurity posture. And it's important to also note that some controls within this framework, and again, some controls within other frameworks, they might not be relevant or applicable to certain organizations. But that's okay, because the NIST CSF in particular, it's considered a voluntary framework unless you're a US government federal agency. So 100% compliance isn't mandatory for probably any, I'm assuming, organization here. Again, the key is that it's providing a baseline. Implementing that framework is a baseline. So of course, the NIST CSF isn't the only framework out there. Like I mentioned earlier, some other frameworks are required if you handle certain types of data, and you've probably heard of at least 1 or 2 of the frameworks in this slide. You might have heard of GDPR, which is arguably one of the world's strongest set of data protection rules. So the aim of GDPR was to unify all these separate EU country data privacy laws. So all these different countries in the EU, they each kind of had their own privacy laws, some strong, some weak. But the goal of GDPR was to unify that all into one giant single harmonized result. And this framework essentially sets guidelines for what companies can and can't do with information of residents inside the EU. But that doesn't mean that just EU companies are on the hook. GDPR actually affects organizations everywhere, because you're likely serving some kind of information somehow to residents of the EU. They're probably able to access your information somewhere. So Facebook and Google, for example, among many others, those have been fined millions for non-compliance to GDPR. And if we look at some of the other examples here, say HIPAA typically applies to patient health information. So your favorite doctor's office or health insurance, they're most likely required to be HIPAA compliant due to the information they handle. PCI handles payment card data, so PCI DSS. So any merchant accepting card data from the major brands, they must be PCI DSS compliant to be able to do so. And CMMC applies to DoD contractors. The goal of that framework is to safeguard certain sensitive national security data. And again, this is only a handful of frameworks. There are many, many more out there as well. Next slide. So unfortunately, compliance isn't just for for-profit organizations. So us nonprofits, we might be on the hook as well. So maybe you allow membership or serve information to residents of the EU. Well, since it's accessible there, you're now handling data from a resident of the EU, and you might need to be aware of what you can and can't do now with that information under GDPR. You might handle donor data. Maybe you have a homegrown payment option on your website somewhere, or something that means you're handling card information. Now you're PCI, you're required to be PCI compliant. Maybe you're handling health information. Again, you get the point. So it's important to do the due diligence on your organization. and map out the types of information you handle so that you understand what you might and might not be on the hook for. So you mentioned fines in our first webinar, and I mentioned fines earlier as well. Obviously, no for-profit organization wants to be fined, but it's a lot easier for Facebook or Google to shrug off $1 million fine than it is for us, right? We're non-profits, we just simply, unfortunately, don't have the resources to be paying fines for non-compliance. Next slide. So if we take a step back just for a second, so we don't lose ourselves in governance, risk, and compliance, let's take a look at what these frameworks, let's say the NIST CSF, let's look at what they can actually do for cybersecurity maturity. So these frameworks, they might look a little bit scary from a resource standpoint. It's easy to forget that the controls within these frameworks, these sets of actions, they're meant to ensure your cybersecurity program is mature. So it's not just that they're there for, it's not just compliance for the sake of compliance. Yes, some are necessary depending on the data you handle. But if you're going to begin implementing a voluntary framework like the NIST CSF, compliance for the sake of compliance, that doesn't really apply. Again, the idea is that it's helping provide a baseline security posture. So when you take some of these controls that are listed out in these frameworks, again, let's take the NIST CSF, for example. When you take some of these controls and begin tying them to risk, and you say, this is what this particular control within the NIST CSF is doing, this is how it's protecting us in a certain area, this is how it's mitigating risk in a certain area, that's how we can actually begin quantifying these security investments. That's how we can prove that, spending the money that we might need to spend on implementing a certain framework, that's how we prove what it's actually doing for us, rather than just, ticking off a compliance checkbox somewhere. So it's important to remember, if you take anything away from this, it's that frameworks aren't just there to be scary and steal money from organizations who aren't compliant. They're there because they're providing what's been identified as best practices or guidelines to protect certain types of data within your environment. And again, it's important to build that bridge between risk and compliance. And next slide, please. And I'll throw it over to you, Ashley. I believe this is a slide.
That's right. Thanks, Keaton. Also, I apologize for my voice that keeps going in and out. I'm going to hope that it holds close, but just wanted to apologize in advance. Thank you, Keaton, so much for sharing all of that, especially about the NIST cybersecurity framework. I feel like, especially for us nonprofits, it's something that's super important to look at when we're kind of looking at our environment as a whole and looking at how, sensitive data is being handled. When it comes to talking about compliance, a key piece to compliance is really thinking about security education and awareness, which ultimately can empower employee decision-making with handling data to reduce the number of compliance violations. So one of the things that kind of goes in line with compliance is making sure that we're setting up the proper controls, as Keaton mentioned, but also that we're not violating what we've set in our compliance policies, that we're ultimately, making sure that our data is safe, especially when it comes to HIPAA compliance. And ultimately, we can use awareness to meet or help meet some of those compliance requirements, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. But some of the examples of, compliance requirements that we might have to meet, could be around HIPAA, SOC, PCI, ISO 27000 are a few examples. And a lot of these certifications or frameworks often require some form of security awareness and training. So ultimately, it kind of gives an opportunity for us to educate our employees about how to handle, sensitive data, what information to include in an email. For example, in many of your nonprofits, you may find where social security numbers are included in emails. And there are other secure ways to do that rather than sharing through email, which could ultimately, result in a violation. Next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So then kind of the second step to that is earning the compliance check spots. So a lot of the times with these compliance requirements, there's usually some form of security awareness training component. Usually it's an annual security awareness training where, as long as the employees have went through some form of training each year, then they're good to go. And a lot of the times, the security awareness training that we choose to do, and if we might figure, well, one time a year is enough. And that's all that needs to be done to meet that compliance checkbox. The only issue with that is there's a lot of behavioral science that goes into the way that people learn and how they remember things. And there's ultimately science that proves just basically learning things one time a year is not effective to result in actual behavior change. It has to be a consistent habit. So one of the things that we can do when we're thinking about compliance is building a security awareness program, training program that kind of meets compliance requirements. So how do we do that? Ultimately, we just have to look at when we're educating people, how we're doing it, and how are we tracking progress, even if it's in an Excel document. So for example, you can find a YouTube security training or a free security training. There's a lot of different free security awareness training providers out there, and basically push that out to your organization on a certain day and just have a way to monitor who has watched that video and who hasn't, and just keep track of that for an external auditor. So this way you can say, person A reviewed the video at this time and they completed the video at this time, just so that you're able to provide proof that security awareness training is happening. And then you could even go a step further and show, how effective is that training? Are you seeing reduced cyber risks? And ultimately, these, compliance requirements, they can also be required if you're looking at things like cyber liability insurance. A lot of those in the policy and the fine print often require that you have a compliance framework, as Keaton was mentioning, as well as security awareness training. Next slide, please. And I will hand it back to Keaton to speak to us a bit about privacy.
Cool, thank you. So that was a lot of information. Sounds like scary stuff, so we don't want to be down in the weeds for too long. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit and pivot to one of my favorite areas, which is privacy. Again, we had quite a few questions on this last time. Some questions around this area. And some specific recommendations too. So we definitely wanted to circle back on this and give this another glance over. So I think at this point, most of us probably understand the importance of privacy to a certain extent. We know to be careful sharing certain things, how we share it, where we share it, in order to protect ourselves and our families. But one thing people often forget is how that information we share can affect the organizations that we work for too. So it's something to think about if you're part of any organization, is that you suddenly become a link in the fence. So when somebody wants to test the defenses of your organization's security, one of the first things they do is their due diligence on the employees, and especially their social media. So if you're somebody who has a lot of passwords, for example, that have been leaked in a dozen breaches, that attacker is going to try each of those passwords on your company logins. If you're posting pictures of you at company events with a lanyard and a key card around your neck, that's given an attacker a glimpse into what your ID cards look like. If you take pictures at your office and you've got sticky notes all over your monitors, again, free information. So it's important when you think about privacy that it's not just about you, it's not just about your family. It's really important to be conscious of the information you're giving out online, because again, you may unknowingly be the weakest link in your organization's chain. Next slide. Thank you. So some specific recommendations I have, and none of these that I'm going to mention have any connection to Pocket Security or anything. These are just solutions that I personally trust. So if you're trying to become more conscious of information you share with Google, for example, or maybe you're just after more secure email options, I highly recommend checking out Proton Mail or Tutor Nota over Gmail. So both of these are located outside of the US and the Five Eyes, deliberately placed in Switzerland and Germany, respectively, due to the strong privacy laws that they have in both of their both of their countries. VPNs are a little bit of a tougher one to recommend. Your own due diligence research is important here. With VPNs, it's important to remember that your information doesn't just become invisible if you're using a VPN. It doesn't just disappear. It just becomes a question of what organization do you trust more than your ISP, right? So if I'm using NordVPN, for example, do I trust NordVPN more? than whether I have AT&T or Verizon or whoever for my internet. Again, I like Proton, so I go with Proton VPN on that one. Messaging apps, that's a fun one. I think most of us now know that SMS, basic texting, is pretty insecure, and people are always looking for a way to privately message, so end-to-end encrypted messaging. One of my favorites is the open source Signal messenger. It's continuing to mature constantly, and I've never had any major issues with it. Other people like Telegram. I do use that for certain things as well, but I was wary in the beginning due to its proprietary encryption. But I will admit, I'll eat my own hat on this one. I will admit that it has so far been it has a pretty good track record of not giving information up to government entities, specifically in Russia. A lot of people also use WhatsApp, but I don't personally recommend WhatsApp as it is owned by Facebook, or Meta as they call themselves now. And I'm not sure that we have the time to get into the implications of Facebook owning the encryption keys to your chat. I don't think there's enough time in the day for that one, but I think we can understand that one. Social media, it's another trickier one to recommend, just due to the sheer size of the primary social media platforms out there today. It's also difficult to move over friends and family onto different social medias. So if you're trying to gain more privacy in these areas, it's not so easy, as most people just want to stick to the main ones. I mean, I'm guilty of that too, right? I've yet to find a platform like Instagram, for example, that can provide the reach that it does. It's just unfortunately not really yet possible to compete with that. But one I can recommend is Mastodon. It's like a Twitter alternative mostly. It's decentralized, it's open sourced, and you can find a decent amount of cybersecurity folks on there too, who like to use it as their main platform for microblogging. And that will conclude the second webinar. Again, we introduce you to compliance frameworks, as well as giving you some privacy topics. I hope you're able to learn something here, and best case scenario that you take something from this and you're able to strengthen your organization's security posture. We can open up to a Q&A now, unless Ashley, there was anything in particular that you wanted to go over.
No, I think that sums it up for me as well.
All right, cool. So we can open up a Q&A then.
Yeah, I had an initial question. So I worked at a mental health provider before working for SVCN, and sometimes county partners would just would send us information about our clients, and it would be too much information to email. And I was wondering, how would you navigate just like external partners not really or breaking compliance?
Ashley, did you want to take that one?
All you, Keaton.
Okay. Could you just rephrase it again, Marva?
Yeah, so how do we navigate times when external partners break compliance?
Oh, okay. So yeah. So like when you have some kind of company or whatever, they're sending you information that should not have been in an email, for example. So that's, yeah. So when you have these frameworks in place, there are going to be controls specifically. I think in I would say probably most of them, they're going to have controls and policies in place for what you do when external parties or third parties, etc., do not follow those. So that's going to be in the frameworks, and usually it's going to be filling out some kind of incident response or something along the lines of that. So it's going to be in those controls, like within the NIST CSF, basically.
Thank you. We seem to have a message from the chat. If you can include the names of the recommended VPN and messaging apps. So if you can just repeat that, and I can try to get them in the chat.
Okay, yeah. So recommended VPN, I like Proton VPN. Again, there's a million VPNs. It's just kind of up to your own due diligence and research. Again, it just becomes a question of who you trust more than whoever your ISP is, or whatever reason you're using VPN. Messaging apps, there is Signal and Telegram. Signal is the one that I like the most. It's the open source one. Telegram runs its own proprietary encryption, but again, they have had a good track record of not giving up information. And then email, I like Proton Mail and Tutor Nota. It's probably a difficult one to spell, so I can throw that one out there.
And I absolutely agree with all of Keaton's choices. I'm also a user of Proton Mail for my email as well as Signal. And one of the things that I like the most about Signal is if you're familiar with using iOS, it's a very similar user experience. So it will kind of feel more like using your native, iMessage as opposed to using something that looks scary and, that, someone on like the dark web might use. Like it just is very user friendly.
And I can say the same from the Android side as well. It's it looks pretty native, and you can even use it as your native text messaging app. So if you're trying to text somebody from the app, it'll just send them a normal text if the other person isn't a user of Signal. But if the other person is a user of Signal, then it'll automatically send an end-to-end encrypted message instead of SMS.
Another question kind of related to, you mentioned that we can just watch a cybersecurity video online for free and then just document when people are actually watching it. Is there like a recommended amount of time the cybersecurity video should be, or any other
Really good.
recommendations I'm looking?
Yeah, really good question. So I'll kind of suggest a few things there. So in terms of besides YouTube and kind of finding a video on security education, I feel like a video that's at max like 5 to 10 minutes long, any longer than 10 minutes, it kind of gets to be that dreaded security training that everyone's like, why do I have to sit through this? So I feel like under 10 minutes is really is the amount of time. If you can find one that's shorter, really, I would say the key aspects are that it's covering the topics that are most important to us as nonprofits. So, how to look for suspicious indicators in emails and text messages, how to, handle data sensitively, how to make sure data is being locked in a filing cabinet if you have files out, really simple things like that. It doesn't have to be anything extreme. And then we're not affiliated with this provider at all, but I know the company Wiser, and I'll put that in the chat as well. They they offer free security training that you could potentially roll out in your organizations. It's a free training that's kind of in that time frame that I suggested that would meet those requirements. Really good question.
Yeah, and I can also add something to that too. Yeah, it's a lot of the security awareness companies or providers, they seem to be kind of moving to a kind of gamified or like cartoony kind of short snippets of information. So the security awareness provider that I use, or that we use at my organization, is Ningio. Again, not affiliated with them at all. But it's like 4 or 5 minute little cartoony videos once a month, and that does, I believe, check off the security awareness checkbox within the whatever we need it for, and I think they're also pretty affordable as well. I think it's the price is scaled off of how many people are in your organization. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of affordable or free security awareness, and typically it is just 4 or 5 minutes here or there, because you don't want to put people to sleep.
Thank you again to Pocket Security for this presentation.